Greetings and various assorted salutations. This is the last lecture for World War II, or at least at the time of this writing, or this version of the lecture series. There's quite a bit to cover. We're going to end the war in Europe, and we're going to look at the end of the war in the Pacific, to be specific. It's a lot of ground to cover, but we'll start with Europe. This picture here, I believe, is from the Battle of the Bulge, which was the last German Nazi ditch effort to try and push the Allies back. But we'll get to that. Here's the terms list. As you may know, it may vary from the terms list in your assignments. I recommend doing the ones in your assignments and then just being aware of these terms in here. First on to VE Day, the March to VE. Now, while the United States was caught in a two-front war itself, the Germans were caught in a much more pressing two-front war. Essentially, what happened is we got the Soviets pushing in from the east through Central and Eastern Europe. And then we've got the British and the Americans, particularly, driving in from the west. And the Germans, they would be basically fighting in their own homeland, whereas in the United States, our two-front war inconvenience was transportation. No one could really strike us very easily during this war. But now, the Soviets marched upon Germany over the top of corpses of millions of Russians and other Eastern and Central Europeans. It's thanks in part to the massive sieges of Stalingrad and Leningrad that the Germans lost tons of resources and thousands of lives in an effort to turn around Operation Barbarossa. And the Soviets were determined to take Berlin. And the Allies, the British and the Americans, they were pushing up through France and Belgium. So there's some pictures that you can look at. Always remember, you can access the lecture slides in the YouTube description below. Or I believe in the learning management system, it's usually above the lecture. You can access the pictures and look at them in more detail. But, no. There was, in desperation, the German army attempts to launch one last counteroffensive. The Ardennes counteroffensive, but most people honestly remember it as the Battle of the Bulge because of the way it looks on the map. Essentially, in the bitter cold winter of 1944, achieving total surprise, American troops were attacked by Nazis in a last-ditch blitzkrieg. Due to the weather, air support was limited, and it wouldn't be for a few days until General Patton's army would turn around and reinforce and help those battered troops in the forest. But the failure cost the Nazis dearly. They lost a lot of materials, tanks, gasoline, and troops and equipment in the process of this desperate counterattack. But now, in 1945, in April, Soviet and American troops would meet at the Elbe River in Germany. Winston Churchill had actually suggested to Dwight D. Eisenhower, the general of the Allied command, to press on. In fact, he advised them to press on into Czechoslovakia, go past Germany and into Czechoslovakia. And the idea behind this is Allied British troops and American troops could then be in a position to better fight the Soviets. Now, is this surprising? The Allies, the British and the Soviets, and the Americans, they were never really on the best of terms. The U.S. and the British reject communism, and the Soviets feel that all nations should give way to the rise of humanity united under the banner of communism. Generals like Patton, for example, felt that the German army could be picked up, denazified, and used to go crush the Soviets once and for all. Churchill toyed with the idea of having a denazied Germany, the liberated French, British, and Americans going in and ending the communist threat once and for all. This would have dragged the war on significantly longer to a very different ending that would be a fascinating topic for alternative history and fiction. But General Eisenhower opposed this idea of using U.S. troops to do this, and he stopped them in the German Elbe River. The logistics of crushing the Soviets while the Japanese fought on was really unthinkable and impractical. However, Dwight D. Eisenhower's decision would seal the fate of many Central and Eastern European nations. Most of them would be snapped up and controlled as satellite nations, satellite states, controlled by the Soviet Union out of Moscow. And that'll set up the next conflict in the next time period, in the next unit we'll be studying, the Cold War. But we need to end World War II before we even think about that. Essentially, the Soviets are going to march in Berlin on 1945 in May, and victory in Europe, called VE Day, is going to be May 8th, 1945. The German surrender. Italy is down, the Nazis are out, only the Japanese Empire remains. And that leads us to the Pacific Theater. The Allies in Asia would resort to a tactic called island hopping. Admiral Nimitz with the Navy and the Marines, General Douglas MacArthur with the Army, they would attack certain islands in the Pacific as their significance was determined. Usually there was an airfield there, or a port. Higgins landing craft were a staple of these amphibious invasions, of course. And these islands were targeted because they were convenient places with airfields on them. And the Navy liked to call these airfields, these airports, unsinkable aircraft carriers, because no one could sink an island. Allied forces would need to knock the Japanese off enough islands to get close enough to the Japanese home islands. If by taking these different islands, they'd create a chain to basically link up a supply line and an airfield line to launch the invasion of Japan itself. This was projected to be the ugliest campaign of the war, and optimistically, military analysts estimated 1 million Allied soldiers dying in the first month of the battle of the invasion of Japan. But before they get to that, General Douglas MacArthur fulfills his promise in 1945 and returns and recaptures the Philippines. While the Filipinos were not exactly excited to be an American colony, they had believed in the promise of the Tidings-McDuffie Act, promising their freedom after a certain amount of time had passed and the transition could be completed. Philippine resistance had endured Japanese efforts of enslaving and mass murder of Filipinos. And just as General MacArthur vowed to return and liberate the islands, America would keep her promise, and the Philippine Islands would obtain full independence as an independent and free nation after the war on July 4th of 1946. There's a picture of General MacArthur coming on the beaches of the Philippine Islands. Now, as the war drags on, the United States basically has to totally defeat the Japanese military and navy to end this war. And as the Japanese empire was shaved away at through island hopping, the Japanese grew increasingly desperate as their fleet was sunk, their aircraft were lost. Some pilots were trained as suicide bombers called kamikaze. Kamikaze refers to, it's Japanese for divine wind, and it refers to a typhoon that actually struck a Mongol invasion. The Mongols, they tried to take over much of Asia, Europe, and whatnot at a certain period of time. They also took a shot at Japan, but a typhoon actually blew through and damaged, sunk, and forced their fleet to turn away. And so the idea was that the kamikaze of World War II were the divine wind that would drive back the Allies. Further, the Japanese troops put up fierce resistance. The most famous cases are at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. These islands were heavily fought over. Some of the ugliest fighting that the Americans ever did was on these islands. Typically, Allied troops had to kill almost every soldier on the island to end the battle. But no, because Japanese soldiers did believe that surrender was dishonorable and a fate worse than death in many situations. But with the fall of Okinawa, Japan, the United States was finally posed to invade Japan, and the Marines and others were getting ready to grimly go house to house. It was expected that the fighting on the Japan main islands would be a fight house to house, town to town, a fight to the last man, woman, and child, who were fighting to defend their homeland and the emperor. It was expected that the Soviets would have to join in the invasion, and they too would suffer dearly. It would not be a pretty fight. The Japanese hadn't given up. Tokyo had been burned to the ground through firebombing, but the United States had two final attempts to try before invasion. Something unexpected at the time: the bomb. Irony has a cruel sense of humor. Of the various Jews and non-Aryans chased out of Europe by the Nazis, they took with them technologies and knowledge that would power the second half of the 20th century. Two particular of note are going to be Albert Einstein, a genius scientist who happened to be of Jewish descent, and Enrico Fermi, who, in loving his Jewish wife more than his loyalty to Mussolini's Italy, who, like the Nazis, sought to have people like her removed from the planet Earth, he came to America with his family. And these immigrants, they brought along with them secrets. In fact, the U.S. government would build a secret city worth of scientists, creating the Manhattan Project. The project sought to unleash the power of atoms, the building blocks of all matter and all existence, the power of the universe as a weapon. Now, we're going to learn more about the bomb, atom bomb, in the next unit, the Cold War, but here are the basics. The atom bomb, also called the nuclear bomb, uses the power of splitting atoms like uranium or plutonium to create an explosion. Essentially, breaking an atom, splitting it, is called fission, and when you split an atom, which isn't exactly the easiest thing to do, it creates a massive explosion. Previously, the only level of energy released would have been from things like stars. That's the type of energy levels we're talking about. But the atom bombs were tested in the deserts of southwestern United States out of the secret city laboratory of Los Alamos. They were really developed too late to be used in Germany, and rather the Japanese would become, and God willing, the only peoples who these weapons would ever be used against. And so, these terrible weapons. But essentially, this is the scenario. On August 6, 1945, a single B-29 bomber flies over the city of Hiroshima, an old city founded in 1598. It was a key port in southern Japan, as the map shows there. Few Japanese reacted to this bomber, figuring it was either going to drop some leaflets calling for surrender, or was doing recon work for the expected invasion, or a later, bigger bombing run. A single bomb was dropped, though, from the B-29 named Enola Gay. Named Little Boy, it was a 10-foot-long bomb carrying the element uranium-235. When the fission process occurred, for a brief moment a new sun formed on the surface of the planet Earth. The flashlight was so bright it sunburned those who saw it. The heat from this light instantly started fire, and those closest to the detonation were vaporized where they stood. The blast of the bomb is the same as 15 kilotons of TNT and destroyed almost every building in the area except for this one in the very center, which would happen to be right below the blast. In less than a moment, Hiroshima was gone. In the days and years that followed, survivors who rushed out to help, people outside those zones of total annihilation, they'd rushed in to help, to put out the fires, to try and rescue anyone. They would suffer horrendous pains, vomiting, cancer, and death by radiation poisoning, all because of an instant moment. The Japanese government did not surrender. Despite most of her navy sunk, most of the aircraft destroyed, the army decimated, the fascist government of Japan had no interest in giving in. And so President Truman, he took over for FDR after FDR died on his fourth term. President Truman gave a warning. More atom bombs would be dropped. He vowed more bombs would be dropped. And Truman had to make the heavy decision, going from vice president to president, of making the decision of, was it better to use a nuclear bomb or conduct an invasion that would involve millions of deaths and likely the genocide of entire islands. 3 days passed. August 9th, 1945. The United States will repeat this process, bombing the city of Nagasaki. Perhaps ironically, this port city is where many Europeans and Japanese had contact dating back to the 16th century. The bomb, though, was bigger. Named Fat Man, it destroyed Nagasaki in an instant. Basically, to end World War II, the United States fielded bombs more terrifying than chemical warfare and more destructive than aircraft carriers or tanks. Other cities suffered more damage from bombing, but nothing has ever been instantly destroyed through like the way an atom bomb works. The Emperor of Japan, the Imperial House of Yamato, a family which has ruled the nation dating back to 650 BC, a god amongst the Japanese in the Japanese state religion, he did the unthinkable. He pushed aside the generals and admirals who'd run the empire in his name, and he spoke directly on the radio to his people, calling for them to stand down and for the Japanese government to surrender. Victory over Japan, VJ Day, is September 2nd, 1945. The papers would be signed aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Harbor as overseen by General MacArthur. World War II has ended. If you ever want to see the surrender documents, I believe they're still hanging in the hall. We have a copy of them hanging in the hallway of the Social Studies Department, if you're ever able to get the chance to look at that. But that ends World War II. America, Britain, Australia, the Soviet Union ended their battles against the Axis powers. France would return as a free nation. In matters of occupation and war crimes will occur over the next few years, war crime trials. But essentially, World War II would see the end of the major European fascist dictatorships. It would see the halting of the genocide of Jews in the Holocaust and the genocide of other groups, such as the Gypsies or Roma, and many other groups. Central and Eastern Europe would see a massive refugee crisis, and the Soviets would consolidate those countries into satellite states. Meanwhile, Asia and Africa are going to start going through a decolonization process, and a new world order will be established by the competing factions of the United States, the Soviet Union, and France, as well as England decolonizing. A newer, potentially world-ending conflict is going to be stirring after World War II, but that's a topic for another unit. That's enough for now. World War II has ended for our unit. I'll see you in the next unit. Until later.